Political experts John Baick and Ryan McCollum had plenty to say about what Mueller had to say or not say and how this testimony impacts the talk of impeachment against President Trump. And they shared their thoughts with me in the studio.
This is not going to change the political calculus very much. He said what he said he was going to say, what's in the report. And what he said in the report was very careful, very disciplined, and both a damning indictment, yet short of criminal acts on the part of the president and his campaign.
What were your impressions, Ryan, and what did you take away from what Robert Mueller had to say?
So my biggest thing was that Russia did attack our elections. And so that's the biggest takeaway from me, and I think should be the biggest takeaway from our country. The political calculus and how he looked and if it was good for Democrats or good for Republicans. Like the professor says, I don't think it moved the needle much one way or the other. But I do think that more people are now realizing that, our elections are not completely secure. And we need to do something about that.
I mean, he was emphatic that President Trump has indicated, the Russian interference was a hoax, a witch hunt, so forth and so on. But Mueller was emphatic that Russia not only interfered with the election in 2016, but they were continuing to interfere in elections in America. That was emphatic. Also, no exoneration on obstruction for the president, as the president has claimed. Clear of obstruction, but this report indicated he wasn't exonerated on obstruction.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the report made it clear, but the difference with that lack of exoneration is that William Barr, the Attorney General, put out a memo. He put out a memo, and the president put out his tweets. And in the minds of a lot of Americans, this was exoneration, no collusion. That term, no collusion, has been used over and over, even though specifically Mueller and his team said collusion is not a legal term.
Yeah.
So of course there was no collusion, because collusion means nothing. What Ryan was saying, this was an attack, and in some respects, one can consider this an act of war. But it's not an act of war if you don't acknowledge that it was.
Yeah. And what do you think of the way Robert Mueller came across? His demeanor, he answered a lot of yes and no, one-sentence answers. How do you feel that, I don't want to say perform, but how do you feel he came across?
He did what folks thought he would do, who were in the know. I mean, I think this was the 89th time he testified in front of Congress. He stayed within the goalposts of his report. So there was a lot of yes and no's. Some congressmen and women were great to get him out of that yes or no place. I know Schiff was pretty good at trying to get him out of that place, and Nadler. That both the chairmen did well early on to set the bar, but he performed how people thought he would. And I know some people thought he seemed like he didn't lead the investigation, and he seemed, like he didn't know what was going on. But that was just him making sure he wasn't speaking without knowing exactly what he was going to say.
John, did the Democrats get what they wanted out of Robert Mueller's testimony?
In terms of someone who would provide them with cogent sound bites, something that could be used in an ad, no, not even close. Because what he gave them was the words of a prosecutor, the words of a lawyer, the words of a lifelong public servant. He's not a politician. He is not an actor. He is not someone trying to be dramatic. He was trying to say with the least drama possible that we were attacked. When one of the congressmen who leading him through a discussion said, so the president basically lied, he said that would basically be correct. If you look at the report, when the president responded to dozens of questions, his answer was over and over, I do not recall. And it's described in this report as inadequate answers. It's inadequate because perhaps he doesn't recall, perhaps he's lying, but there's no way to truly characterize that. But the report is, if you actually read it, it is kind of stunning.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, did the Republicans come away with what they wanted and anticipated then from Robert Mueller's testimony after hearing it?
I think both sides have been trying to claim victory, and that goes to Bob Mueller as a witness in which he wasn't there to give one side a victory over the other. And so some Democrats scored some points, sometimes they didn't. Some Republicans scored some points, sometimes they didn't. But the Republicans did do a good job of putting forth the fact that his team wasn't completely bipartisan. They talk about Misfud and some of the other people that first started the Russian investigation and where they might have came from and why they didn't investigate that. So the Republicans had an easier job, which was just sowing seeds of doubt in everything, where the Democrats had to, bring this home and hammer it home, and it was an easier job for Republicans to sow seeds of doubt.
So the next step, does this help or hinder the chances or likelihood of impeachment proceedings? Did it move the needle in that direction at all?
Considering that the needle had already been heading in that direction, I don't think this will push it much further. I think it will have some people digging in. I think this will be certainly featured in the next round of Democratic presidential debates. But this is not going to lead 100 new representatives to storm out there. Because the thing about the report, it doesn't exonerate, but it doesn't, beyond a reasonable doubt, find the president and his team guilty.
I think there were like 88 Democrats on board for impeachment proceedings before we heard from Robert Mueller, his testimony. What do you think that number is today? Did it incrementally increase?
It's moved a little bit. I know Lori Trahan, who's a congresswoman in Massachusetts, is now on board with impeachment, and I think Senator Ed Markey is now on board with impeachment. He came out and said the president needs to be impeached. So it has moved the needle very slightly since the end of his testimony.
I do wonder with the midterms coming, not the midterms, but the primaries coming up, I do wonder how many candidates who are challenging incumbent Democrats are going to start pushing impeachment and making that their single issue. You also know that Tom Steyer is still out there with his $100 million, that's his one issue. There will be more and more discussion, but I think Nancy Pelosi, in terms of corralling the Democratic Party, Democratic Congress, I think she has this in hand for now.
So what does Congress do next? Look into your crystal ball and what's going to happen in Congress next?
Well, I think one point, and I'll let you elaborate on this, we're still waiting on financial documents. We're still waiting on taxes. If we start to see a pattern of money coming from unspecified sources, suddenly one of the major arguments here that there was no proof, there was no agreement, there was no support, if there is money coming from unspecified sources in the Trump campaign, in the Trump administration, not Trump administration, but the Trump business and Trump himself, his personal taxes, then this could reopen a lot of questions. But so far he has held off, he has used court challenges, but those are still pending.
And I think they're going to try to get McGahn in and interview him. But as we were speaking about before we started rolling, is election security. And so now taking that volume 1, which is about Russian interference, and putting it into policy and telling the American people that our elections aren't safe. The things people have died for, the right to vote, and now when you go vote, it might not even count. So if Congress is smart, especially the Democratic leaders, if they keep hitting that point that our elections aren't secure and the Republicans don't care about it, that'll be some points scored.
One of the problems was that there is nothing in federal election law that deals with this. I mean, the Manchurian Candidate was a film, as opposed to something like this where it seems to have actually happened. I could see the Congress trying to pass a law saying that working with a foreign government is illegal. The Senate will never vote for it, but that's one way of keeping this Russian issue out there.
I want to turn to another topic now where we have a few minutes left in the program, and that's on the more local level. This past week, Holyoke Mayor Alex Morris announced that he's a candidate for Congress in the 1st Congressional District. He's trying to win the seat now held by Congressman Richard Neal, who has been there for 30 years. Did Alex Morris's announcement come as a surprise to you?
I mean, it didn't come as a surprise to me, and some of the insiders who've kind of seen him laying the groundwork and taking meetings and making phone calls. Alex isn't a turn waiter. He's not going to wait his turn. He didn't wait his turn to run for mayor. He thinks it's his time, and he's going to go out there and really give Richie probably the toughest competition he's seen in a long time. It's still going to be an uphill battle, but he's always been an ambitious person, and I think this is the next step that he saw on his road.
John, as you look at this race, how do you handicap the race, and did Morris getting in surprise you at all?
No, not when he had lunch with Tom Steyer back in April. He is someone who has made it clear that he is ambitious, someone who wants to be a progressive voice, not just in his town. I do think that he is trying to catch some momentum here, trying to align himself with the squad, trying to be part of this voice. He's going to use the word impeachment a lot, and he's going to talk about Richie Neal's bipartisanship as being too cautious, too timid, and it's time for aggressive action. And it's about two different models of government here. It's about Richie Neal's sort of New Deal vision of what government should be versus the new Democratic left, which is about attacking as hard as Republicans have attacked in the last generation.
And a part of any election, of course, especially on the congressional level, is money. Congressman Neal is well funded. He's got something like $4 million in his political war chest. Alex Morris, he'll have a problem raising money, won't he?
And I think the mayor's going to do what the old Karl Rove play is make your strengths your weakness. And so he's going to dig into where that money that Congressman Neal has, where it comes from. If it's corporate PACs and how often are they people in the district? Are they outside the district? So he's going to go after that. And he'll also go after his chairmanship and say, well, he's been the chair of Ways and Means, but what has he done with it? Has he helped out the people of the district, or has he helped out things connected to this corporate money that happens to be in his campaign war chest? So he's going to have to raise some money. He's not going to ever get to the $4 million, but if he can use that money against him, it'll be a positive for Alex.
Normally, an incumbent has a tremendous advantage, as you well know, especially one with a record in Congress like Congressman Neal, who's now chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, a very powerful position. Is the political climate in this country so much more different now that that incumbency doesn't mean as much perhaps as it did years ago? And would this give Alex Morse or any other candidate for that matter a reason for optimism in getting into a race like this?
I think Massachusetts is still a very, very difficult state for someone to break in terms of politics. But a primary is a different kind of animal. And we didn't just see this with Presley out in eastern Massachusetts, but we saw this with Eric Cantor years ago. In a strange political moment, a type of anger and type of frustration can set in, whether it's on the right or the left. And I believe the mayor is going to have to push a lot of buttons to get a base created for himself. If this was a general election, Representative Neal would have no problem whatsoever. But in a primary, sometimes all bets are off. I still think that Representative Neal's fundraising advantage and history, his connection to the region, make him the favorite. But I wouldn't count the mayor out easily.